Welcome to the Life Enrichment Podcast, a reflection space based on the writings, ideas, and philosophies of Jose H. Caraballo, LCSW. This episode may include themes related to childhood trauma, emotional pain, family conflict, or difficult life experiences. Please listen with care and pause if you need to.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're really exploring some heavy themes today, but I promise the destination we're heading toward is one of profound clarity.
Yeah, clarity and intentional healing. And today's deep dive is, it's incredibly personal. We're looking at Jose's own story.
Right, we're focusing on how he moved from this place of sudden, overwhelming emotional alarm to, finally naming his childhood trauma.
Which really changed everything for him. So our mission today is to understand how that journey unfolded and how it ultimately built the foundation for his life's work.
Exactly. And, to really grasp this, I think we have to start at the exact moment his life his perceived reality just unraveled.
Yeah. Okay, so imagine you're driving down the highway. The radio's playing your favorite song, the weather is beautiful, and the engine sounds perfectly fine. You are just cruising.
Sounds pretty ideal.
Right. But then, completely out of nowhere, your dashboard just flashes a red critical engine failure warning, and your stomach drops. You're sitting there thinking, wait, what? Everything was literally fine a second ago.
And that is exactly what happened to Jose, but in his mind. It wasn't during some massive crisis. It didn't happen right after a tragedy. It was literally a Tuesday in the summer of 2013.
Just a normal lunch hour. Right?
Yeah, just a totally normal weekday lunch hour. And out of nowhere, he is hit with this intense, just unavoidable feeling of dread.
Wow.
It was this urgent, blaring message from his own body telling him that something in his life was very, very wrong and needed to change right then.
I think the contrast there is what makes the story so gripping for me. Because minutes before this wave of dread hit him, if you asked him to evaluate his life, he would have told you things were great.
Oh, absolutely.
He had a loving family, an active social life, a career that was blossoming. On paper, there were zero structural issues to point to. He was living what society defines as a successful life.
Yeah, and that brings us to a really fascinating psychological mechanism. Because the conscious mind, the part of us that handles logic and schedules and getting through the day, it's incredibly skilled at constructing narratives.
Right, it tells a good story.
Exactly. It uses the prefrontal cortex to say, look, we have a good job, we have friends, we are safe, everything is totally fine. But our deeper emotional alarms, which are governed by a more primitive part of the brain called the amygdala, they just don't care about that narrative.
So what does the amygdala care about then?
Well, it functions basically as the body's smoke detector, and it keeps a meticulous record of unresolved threat.
Okay, so even if your conscious mind is playing the radio super loud to drown out the noise, the smoke detector is still silently measuring the smoke in the room.
That's a great way to put it, yes. When someone carries unresolved childhood trauma, they're essentially walking around with a smoke detector that is constantly scanning for danger.
Constantly.
Right. And for years, maybe even decades, the conscious mind can suppress those alarms to maintain that facade of a perfect life. But eventually, the gap between the conscious narrative and the unconscious reality, it just becomes too vast.
The body just hits a limit?
Precisely. It overrides the logical brain and it sounds the alarm. So that overwhelming dread Jose felt on his lunch break, that was his nervous system stepping in and saying, hey, we can no longer maintain this illusion.
Which raises a really difficult question, I think. Because if his life looked so good on paper and he felt okay consciously, how did he manage to ignore that massive engine failure brewing under the hood for so long?
Well, the answer there really lies in the survival skills we develop as kids. When a child is trapped in a difficult or a neglectful environment, they don't have the physical power to escape. They can't just leave.
Right, they're entirely dependent.
So they have to develop psychological coping mechanisms just to endure their daily reality. For Jose, his primary shield was the skill he honed very early on, which was the ability to find the silver lining in almost any situation.
Wait, I really want to push back on that for a second. Because isn't finding the silver lining usually sold to us as a purely positive thing? Like modern psychology, self-help books, society in general, they're always telling us to practice gratitude and look on the bright side.
Oh, totally. We hear it all the time.
So are you saying that this kind of optimism, which we usually treat as a huge sign of resilience, is actually a form of self-sabotage.
It's a really vital distinction to make, honestly, because optimism and gratitude, when they are grounded in reality, they are absolutely healthy. But when you are a defenseless child, finding a silver lining isn't about healthy gratitude. It's a desperate survival tactic.
It's just doing whatever you can to get by.
Exactly. It is a form of minimization because you can't change the abusive or neglectful behavior of the adults around you. So the only way to feel safe is to convince yourself that the behavior isn't actually that bad. You essentially paint a silver lining over the neglect so you don't have to face the terrifying truth that your caregivers are failing you.
Oh, wow. Because facing that reality as a kid would just be emotionally unsurvivable. You need them to survive, so you have to believe they're good, which means you have to kind of distort your own reality to make the math work.
You distort reality to survive childhood, yeah. But the problem is you take that distorted lens right into adulthood. The mechanism doesn't just automatically turn off when you blow out the candles on your 18th birthday.
Right. It's baked in.
So as an adult, that same silver lining mechanism actively blinds you to your own trauma. It unintentionally masks harsh realities, because if you are perpetually forcing a positive spin on everything, you never actually acknowledge the pain. You end up continuously invalidating your own experiences.
And Jose knows that this was heavily reinforced by his environment, right? Like he grew up in surroundings that were highly critical and very dismissive of any conversations about emotional pain.
Yeah, very dismissive. If he ever tried to bring up the subject of trauma, he was met with criticism or harsh comparisons or just outright contempt. He was actively trained to keep it to himself.
Which is so damaging.
It is. And worse, he internalized this very specific, dangerous belief. The idea that because, quote, others have it worse, he should just be grateful for what he has and force himself to be happy. He viewed his struggles simply as the hand he was dealt.
Oh, that phrase, others have it worse. That is such a common trap.
It really is.
I mean, it sounds like this grounded, mature perspective, but really it operates as an emotional silencer. It's like this comparative suffering Olympics where literally no one wins.
That's so true. And the thing is, the human nervous system does not operate on a global scale of comparison. Your amygdala does not care that someone somewhere else in the world is enduring worse conditions.
Right. It doesn't watch the news.
Exactly. It only knows its own cortisol levels. It only knows its own immediate environment.
Right.
If you constantly tell yourself that your pain isn't valid because someone else is suffering more, you prevent yourself from realizing you even have something to heal from in the first place.
And Jose writes that he honestly wasn't even aware there was something to heal from. He had never defined himself by his trauma.
Yeah, and that stoicism kept him functioning in society. But it was the exact reason his body finally forced that intense physical experience of dread. The silver lining strategy, it eventually expires.
The body forces the issue. But, experiencing the dread is really just the alarm bell. It doesn't actually tell you how to fix the engine. So for Jose, getting the vocabulary to finally understand what his body was screaming at him, that came from a clinical assessment, didn't it?
It did. He discovered something called the ACE study.
The ACE study. So that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Yes, exactly. It's one of the most significant public health discoveries in modern psychology. It was originally conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And what it does is it looks at the long-term impact of 10 specific categories of difficult events in childhood.
So we're talking about things like abuse and neglect.
Yeah, various forms of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as household dysfunction like domestic violence, substance abuse, or the absence of a parent.
So Jose takes this assessment, and the results are just entirely paradigm shifting for him because he realizes he is affected by 80% of the adverse events listed in the study.
8 out of 10 categories. It's staggering.
It is. We're talking about profound neglect, emotional and physical abuse, domestic violence. And seeing it codified like that on clinical document, it forces him to look directly at the despair he had endured, but without that protective filter of the silver lining.
Right. The ACE study provided him with something so crucial, which is empirical validation. It teaches him that traumatic events are not just bad memories that you should try to, get over.
It's biological.
Exactly. Chronic exposure to stress hormones like cortisol during childhood actually alters the physical structure of the developing brain. It changes how the hippocampus processes memory. It hypersensitizes the amygdala. It has a tangible, lasting impact on physical and mental health.
And reading his account of this discovery, I feel like the most powerful shift isn't even just the biological understanding. It's this deeply personal, emotional realization that it was not his fault.
Yes, that is huge.
Right. He writes that he didn't ask for it, he didn't start it, he didn't deserve it. He was just a defenseless child at the mercy of adults who inflicted harm, and he literally did nothing to warrant that treatment.
We really have to pause and just consider the immense weight of that realization, because naming the trauma gave it boundaries. For his entire life, he carried his emotional pain as a personal failing.
Just assuming he was flawed.
Yeah, by viewing it simply as the hand he was dealt, he was holding this quiet, solitary burden, assuming his internal struggles were a flaw in his own character.
But seeing it on a clinical checklist transforms it from a character flaw into a medical reality.
It externalizes the cause. Giving his experience a clinical framework allowed him to step back and observe his past objectively. It says, these are things that happened to me, not things that were caused by me. And that realization is really the only thing capable of removing that incredibly heavy burden of internalized shame.
It takes the blame out of his own body and places it firmly where it belongs.
Yes.
But, understanding that intellectually is only half the battle. You can look at a checklist and logically agree with the data all day long. But his body still had to physically process this massive revelation. He was still reeling from that Tuesday afternoon dread.
Yeah. The mind and the body eventually have to sync up, and that process is rarely graceful.
I can imagine.
Jose writes that while he was still feeling the shock of the dread, the intellectual realization collided with his physical reality, and he just sobbed uncontrollably. It was this massive, involuntary surge of emotions hitting him all at once. Sadness, guilt, shame, deep pain, and just this overpowering sense that something was profoundly wrong.
It sounds like his brain finally just dropped the firewall. Let me try to put this into an analogy. It makes me think of a software developer dealing with a massive computer system that just keeps freezing up.
Okay, yeah.
So for years, they've just been putting these metaphorical band-aids on it, restarting the computer, ignoring the error messages, forcing the silver lining so they can just keep working. But finally, the system crashes entirely. And when they open up the back-end code, they realize it's just full of faulty legacy scripts written decades ago.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
So the weeping, that physical breakdown he experienced, wasn't just sadness. It was his internal operating system finally processing 30 years of backlogged error reports all at once.
And that takes an immense amount of physical energy. He was totally exhausted. He went home, called it quits for the day, and just went to sleep, basically hoping to survive the overwhelm.
But the aftermath of that sleep is where the transformation actually begins. He wakes up from what he describes as the deepest sleep he'd had in a long time, and the dread is gone. Like completely gone.
Replaced by peace.
Yes, profound peace and tranquility.
You know, we spend so much of our cultural and personal energy trying to go around negative emotions. We try to outrun the sadness, or we mask the shame with productivity, or paint that silver lining over our fear. But true emotional processing demands that you move directly through the surge.
You have to let the system crash.
You have to let it crash. You have to experience the overwhelming backlog of emotions without fighting them. Because only by moving through that storm can you actually reach the calm on the other side.
And initially, Jose thought this clarity might just be a strange fluke, like a weird physiological reset after a bizarre Tuesday. But the clarity stayed. He writes about this subtle but massive shift in how he perceived his entire existence. He said it felt as if he had, and I love this quote, finally become fluent in a language he had been studying for years.
Think about what it really means to study a language versus being fluent in it. When you're just studying, you know the individual words. You can navigate a city, maybe order off a menu. You can survive, but you are constantly translating in your head.
Right. It takes so much mental effort.
Exactly. It takes immense cognitive effort just to understand a basic sentence. And that was his life before piecing things together, managing his reactions, forcing the optimism. But fluency means you no longer have to translate. You just inherently understand.
Suddenly, the context of his own life just made sense. The language of his past was unlocked. His experiences, his relationship patterns, his choices, his missteps, all the puzzle pieces finally fit together because he was looking at the right picture on the front of the box. But how does this newfound fluency translate into actual intentional healing? Because feeling peaceful in a moment of clarity is wonderful, but the reality of daily life still requires action.
Well, the initial realization is just the spark. The healing journey is the fire you have to deliberately tend to. This is where Jose shifted from unconscious survival to conscious living. Over the next few years, he took this new fluency and applied it to every single aspect of his existence. He didn't just passively observe it, he meticulously documented it. He compiled over 900 journal entries.
Wow, over 900 journal entries. I mean, that is not just writing Dear Diary at the end of the day. That is a rigorous, deeply intentional audit of a human life.
It is the hard work of identifying what behaviors belong to the trauma and what desires actually belong to the authentic self. Those 900 entries became his customized roadmap. They allowed him to press what he calls the reset button on his life.
So what does that reset actually look like in practice, like day to day?
It meant taking a hard inventory of his current reality and establishing boundaries. He actively distanced himself from draining, dysfunctional relationships that basically mirrored his childhood dynamics.
That makes a lot of sense.
He leaned away from hollow obligations and really leaned into finding deep, authentic fulfillment in his work. And he began practicing daily gratitude, but not the forced, toxic, others have it worse kind of gratitude used for denial.
Right, a real gratitude.
A genuine, grounded appreciation for the peaceful life he was now actively building.
He writes that through this process, he realized he was worthy of something better. Understanding the trauma revealed a life that was meant for him rather than one that was simply forced upon him by his circumstances.
And the life he carved out wasn't modeled after traditional societal notions of success. It wasn't about accumulating wealth or chasing status just to prove his worth. He describes building a life immersed in awe and beauty, a life lived in harmony with what the world actually has to offer.
That's beautiful.
He found a depth of happiness and connection he didn't even know he was missing, simply because his trauma had previously set the ceiling so incredibly low.
It is remarkable to think about the energy exchange there, because he was operating at what he perceived to be full capacity before the dread hit on that Tuesday. But in reality, he had been running on a tiny fraction of his true potential, because so much of his internal bandwidth was just being used to keep the trauma contained behind that silver lining.
Yeah, and when you no longer have to spend your emotional energy maintaining a facade or translating a foreign language or suppressing a biological alarm system, you suddenly have vast amounts of emotional bandwidth available. That energy can finally be directed toward experiencing joy, cultivating awe, and finding true fulfillment.
Bringing this journey back to you, the listener, we've explored Jose's path from that sudden warning light on the dashboard to naming the trauma through the ACE study, to the intensive journaling that ultimately rebuilt his foundation. How can you apply the first step of this intentional healing to your own life?
Well, the very first step to reaching an enriched, authentic life is to simply take a closer, honest look at your past. You do not have to write 900 journal entries today.
Thank goodness.
Right, you don't have to overhaul your entire life by tomorrow morning, but you can start by offering yourself the gift of validation. Acknowledge what happened to you without minimizing it. Stop forcing a silver lining over things that were genuinely harmful, and please stop comparing your pain to the pain of others. Your experiences belong to you, they shaped your nervous system, and they matter.
They absolutely matter. As we close our time together today, I want to leave you with a new concept to carry with you. In Japan, there is an art form called kintsugi. When a piece of pottery breaks, they do not throw it away, and they do not try to glue it back together to hide the cracks.
I love this concept.
It's so powerful, isn't it? Instead of hiding the break, they repair the pieces using lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The repair itself becomes a beautiful, illuminated part of the object's history. Recognizing your past trauma doesn't mean you are permanently broken. It means you finally have the opportunity to see where the cracks are, so you can begin the repair.
Wow.
So, where in your own life might you be hiding a crack with a silver lining, instead of allowing yourself to acknowledge the break and begin filling it with gold? For more reflections, resources, and tools, visit the Center for Life Enrichment.
This podcast is for education and reflection only. It is not therapy, medical advice, or a substitute for professional care. If you are in crisis or immediate danger, contact emergency services or call or text 988 in the United States.